Nobody in Grover's Bluff had ever seen a bride cry before the vows. Most women who stood at that altar managed at least a composed smile, something to offer the gathered crowd, something to take home in memory. But Celeste Harrington stood with her hands folded at her waist and her eyes red from the night before, and she did not bother to hide it. She had made her peace with looking pitiful. It was easier than pretending. The church was full. It was always full when something worth talking about was happening, and a Harrington girl marrying Harlan Whitfield was certainly that. Harlan stood at the front of the room in a jacket that fit him well enough, but had clearly been brushed off rather than pressed. But his boots were clean. She noticed that much, but they were worn down at the heel in the way that said he had walked a long road and had not thought to replace them. He was tall, broader through the shoulder than she had expected. He kept his hands at his sides and his eyes forward, and he did not look at her when she came down the aisle. Not until she was standing directly beside him. Then he turned, just slightly, and looked at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand. She looked away first. The arrangement had been her father's doing, as most things in her life had been. Edmund Harrington was not a cruel man. He was simply a man who had run out of options and had not yet admitted it to himself. The drought had taken 2 seasons from them. The bank had taken the rest of its patience. And Harlan Whitfield had appeared in Edmund's study one evening in March with a proposition so quiet and so reasonable that Edmund had sat with it for 3 days before he said yes. Celeste had not been given 3 days. She had been given 1 evening and a look from her father that she had learned long ago not to argue with. "He's a decent man," Edmund had told her. "He works hard. He asks for nothing unusual." "He lives alone on a mountain," she had said. "Many men live alone. It doesn't make them wrong." She had wanted to say that it didn't make them right either. But she had looked at her father, really looked at him, at the new lines around his mouth and the way his shoulders carried something invisible and heavy, and she had swallowed the words. That was 3 weeks ago. Well, now she was standing in front of Reverend Alcott, with rice drying in her hair from the handful some child had thrown too early, and Harlan Whitfield was sliding a plain silver band onto her finger with hands that were steady when hers were not. The reception was held in the yard outside the church. Tables were set. Someone had brought a fiddle. The women of Grover's Bluff moved in careful clusters, their voices low and their eyes busy. Celeste knew what they were saying. She had grown up in this town. She knew exactly how its mouth moved. Ruth Pickett stood near the lemonade with her sister and smiled at Celeste with the particular warmth of a woman who was privately delighted by someone else's misfortune. Ruth's husband owned the feed store. Ruth had opinions about everything and kept none of them to herself. "Oh, she looks pale," Ruth said to her sister, not quietly enough. "I'd look pale too." Celeste took a slow sip from her cup and did not turn around. It was Harlan who appeared beside her without announcement, the way he seemed to do everything, without ceremony, without warning. He did not say anything at first. He simply stood there, close enough that his arm almost touched hers, and looked out at the yard with the same unreadable expression he had worn all morning. "You don't have to stand here," he said finally. "If you'd rather be somewhere else." She glanced at him, set at him. "Where would I go?" He considered that. Fair point. It was the most he had said to her in 3 weeks. She was not sure whether that was a comfort or a concern. They left before the fiddle player started his second song, and Harlan loaded their things into the wagon himself, her 2 trunks, his single bag, and helped her up onto the seat with a hand that was brief and businesslike. She arranged her skirts and looked straight ahead at the road leading north out of town. Several people watched them go. Ruth Pickett watched longest. The road out of Grover's Bluff was flat for the first mile. Then it began to climb. The pines closed in gradually, the way dusk does, not all at once, but in stages, until suddenly the town was gone, and there was only the sound of the wheels and the horses breathing and the wind moving high up through the trees. Celeste had never been north of the mill road. She had never had reason. She looked at the man beside her. He drove with easy hands, his eyes on the trail, his jaw set not with tension, but with something more like habit, and like a man who had made this journey so many times that his body did it while his mind was somewhere else entirely. "How far?" she asked. He glanced at the sky, reading it the way she read a clock. 3 hours, give or take. She nodded and turned back to the trees. 3 hours. 3 hours into a mountain she had never climbed, beside a man she did not know, toward a life she had not chosen. What she did not know, what none of them back in Grover's Bluff knew, not Ruth Pickett, not her father, not a single soul who had watched her leave, was what was waiting for her at the end of that road. And Harlan Whitfield had no intention of warning her. The sun was behind the mountain before they were halfway up. The trail narrowed as it climbed, threading between pines so tall their tops disappeared into the gray of early evening. The air changed too, cooler, cleaner, carrying the faint smell of cedar and something Celeste could not name. She had pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders without thinking about it, and Harlan had noticed and said nothing, which she was beginning to understand was simply his way. She had tried conversation twice in the first hour, once about the weather, once about the horses. He had answered both times, short, considered answers that were neither unfriendly nor particularly warm. Like a man who had grown so accustomed to his own silence that words felt like a second language he spoke carefully and without waste. After that, she had stopped trying and simply watched the trees. It was not entirely unpleasant. That surprised her. What was not surprising was what Ruth Pickett had started the moment the wagon disappeared from view. Grover's Bluff was a town of 400 people and approximately 400 opinions, and Ruth held at least half of them. By the time the reception tables were being folded and the fiddle player was packing his case, she had already covered the full length of Harlan Whitfield's many apparent shortcomings: the worn boots, the pressed but not pressed jacket, the way he had not smiled once during the entire ceremony. "A man who doesn't smile at his own wedding," Ruth said to anyone still listening, "is a man with something sitting heavy on his conscience." Her sister Dora nodded with the enthusiasm of someone who had been nodding at Ruth her entire life. What neither of them knew, what Ruth would have found unbearable to know, was that the man they were discussing had said something to Celeste just before they left that she was still turning over in her mind. He had helped her onto the wagon, and just before he released her hand, he had said very quietly, "I know this wasn't your choice. I won't forget that." She had not known what to do with that. She still didn't. There was one man at that reception who had not gossiped, and had not laughed, and had not watched the wagon leave with anything resembling amusement. Gerald Sutter stood at the edge of the yard, with a cup he never drank from, and eyes that stayed on the north road long after the Whitfield wagon was out of sight. Gerald owned the land that ran along the eastern base of the mountain, had owned it for 11 years, had surveyed every acre of it, and had spent the better part of those 11 years believing that whatever was on the other side of that ridge was either empty or worthless. He had believed that right up until 6 months ago, when one of his ranch hands had come back from a hunting trip with a description that didn't make sense. Gerald had gone up himself, quietly, to see. What he had seen had kept him awake for 6 months, and now Harlan Whitfield had gone and married a Harrington girl, and Gerald's window was closing in a way he did not like at all. He set his cup down on an empty table and walked to his horse without saying goodbye to anyone. The trail leveled for a short stretch around the second hour, and the horses found an easier rhythm. Celeste had drifted somewhere between wakefulness and sleep when the wagon hit a rut and brought her back. She straightened and looked around. The pines had thinned slightly, and through the gaps she could see the valley below. Grover's Bluff reduced to a handful of lamplight squares in the growing dark, small and distant as something from a childhood memory. She looked at it for a long moment. "Do you miss it?" Harlan asked. He was watching the trail, but he had seen her looking. "I've only been gone 2 hours," she said. "That's not what I asked." She considered lying. It would have been the easier thing. Instead, she said, "I don't know yet. Ask me again in a month." He nodded slowly, as if that were a more honest answer than he had expected. "What about you?" she said. "Did you ever miss it, when you first came up here?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I didn't come from Grover's Bluff." She turned to look at him. "Where did you come from?" He kept his eyes on the trail. "Farther east, long time ago." She waited for more. It did not come. But something in the way he said "long time ago," with a weight that had nothing to do with years, made her decide not to push. There was a story behind this man. She had known that from the first evening her father had said his name. She just had not expected to find herself genuinely curious about it. Gerald Sutter reached his ranch house before full dark and went straight past the kitchen where his housekeeper had supper waiting, and into his study where he kept his maps. He spread the largest one across his desk and put his finger on the ridgeline north of town. Then he moved his finger west, following the elevation, until it landed on the parcel he had identified 6 months ago. The parcel had no registered owner in the county records. He had checked 3 times. Whatever Harlan Whitfield had built up there, he had been extraordinarily careful about keeping it off the books. That kind of careful didn't come from nowhere. Gerald pulled a piece of paper from his drawer and began to write a letter to a man he knew in the land registry office 2 counties over. A man who, for the right consideration, could look at things other clerks preferred not to see. He wrote slowly and chose his words with the patience of someone who had learned that rushing was how men made mistakes. Outside his window, the mountain was dark and still against the night sky. He sealed the letter and set it beside his lamp. Whatever Whitfield was hiding up there, Gerald Sutter intended to know it before winter. The wagon slowed. Celeste had not realized she had been holding a kind of low tension in her shoulders the entire journey until she felt Harlan pull back gently on the reins and the horses drop to a walk. She sat up straighter and looked ahead. The trail had widened. The pines on either side stood taller here, older, their trunks thick as barrel staves. And ahead, where the darkness should have simply continued, there was a gate. Iron, is set between 2 stone posts that had been fitted together with a precision that did not belong to a poor man's hands. Harlan stepped down from the wagon without hurry and unfastened the gate latch. He swung it open, returned to the wagon, and clicked the horses forward. Celeste said nothing. Her eyes were moving ahead, down the path beyond the gate, where the trees thinned and the ground leveled, and something large and dark and entirely impossible was beginning to take shape against the sky. She opened her mouth, closed it. The horses walked on. And then the path curved and the pines fell away on both sides. And Celeste Harrington, who had wept at her own wedding, who had married a man she did not know out of a necessity she had not chosen, yet who had ridden 3 hours up a mountain in the dark, telling herself she had made her peace with whatever waited at the top, Celeste Harrington forgot, for a full and complete moment, how to breathe. 2. The house was not what she had imagined. She had not imagined anything. Truthfully, she had refused to, the way you refuse to look directly at something that might disappoint you. But if she had allowed herself to imagine, she would have pictured a cabin. Solid, perhaps. Well kept. The kind of place a capable, solitary man might build for himself over years of quiet effort. She would not have pictured this. It rose from the mountain clearing the way certain things rise, not intruding on the landscape but belonging to it, as if the pines had simply stepped back to make room. Stone and timber, 3 stories, with a wide covered porch wrapping the front and both sides. Windows that caught what remained of the evening light and held it. A chimney at each end, both drawing thin lines of smoke into the sky, yet which meant someone had been here recently. Someone had prepared. Celeste sat on the wagon seat and did not move. Harlan tied off the horses at the post beside the porch steps and turned to help her down. He looked up at her, and something passed across his face. Not quite amusement, not quite nervousness. Something between the two. "You're going to have questions," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am." He offered his hand. She took it and stepped down, and she did not release it immediately the way she had every other time. She stood on the ground and looked up at the house and felt the strange, vertiginous sensation of a world rearranging itself around a fixed point. "How long?" she asked. 7 years, he said. "Built it myself, mostly. Had help for the stonework, 7 years. But while Grover's Bluff had decided who he was and what he was worth, he had been up here, 7 years, building this." "Why?" she asked. And she did not mean, "Why did you build it?" She meant, why did you let them think what they thought? Why the worn boots? Why the silence? Why any of it? He looked at the house rather than at her when he answered. "I came from money," he said. "Back east. Family money. Old and heavy the way that kind gets. I watched what it did to people. What it did to the people around my father. The way they moved differently in his presence. Said things they didn't mean. Wanted things that had nothing to do with him." He paused. "I wanted to know if a person could want me without it." Celeste was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the pines above them. "So you came here," she said. "I came here. Or built something real. Lived small in town so I'd know." "Know what exactly?" He looked at her then. "Whether whoever I ended up with was there because of me or because of this." She did not sleep well the first night, though the bed was finer than any she had slept in, and the room was warm, and the sound of the pines outside the window was not unpleasant. Her mind was too busy for sleep. It kept moving over things, her father's face when he had told her about the arrangement, Ruth Pickett's voice at the reception, the look on Harlan's face when she had come down the aisle and he had turned to look at her with that expression she had not been able to read. She understood it now. He had been nervous. He had simply not been a man who showed nervousness the ordinary way, and she lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about what he had said on the porch. Whether whoever he ended up with was there because of him or because of this. It was either the most romantic thing she had ever heard or the most calculating. She had not decided which. Perhaps it was both. Gerald Sutter's letter reached the registry office on a Wednesday. By Thursday evening, he had his answer, delivered by a rider he had paid extra to move quickly. He read it once at his desk, then set it down, then picked it up and read it again. The land on the north face of the ridge, all 460 acres of it, was registered not under Whitfield, but under a holding company whose principal owner was one Harlan E. Whitfield of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the same Harlan E. or Whitfield, who was the sole heir to Whitfield Timber and Land, a company whose assets, according to the last public record the clerk had been able to locate, were considerable enough to make Gerald Sutter's own holdings look like a kitchen garden. Gerald set the letter down a second time. He sat with it for a long while. Then he did something that surprised even himself. He opened his desk drawer, took out the letter he had begun drafting to his contact at the county assessor's office, the one that would have raised questions about Whitfield's property registration, questions that might have caused a great deal of inconvenience, and he fed it page by page into the small stove in the corner of his study. He was not a good man in every respect, but he was not a fool, and there was a difference he had learned. Between a fight worth having and a wall worth running into. He watched the paper curl and blacken, and told himself he had simply reassessed his position. Winter came early to the mountain that year. Celeste had not expected to find her footing as quickly as she did. She had braced for loneliness, for the slow grind of days in an unfamiliar place beside an unfamiliar man. What she found instead was something she had no precise word for, a gradual easing, like cold muscles warming near a fire. Harlan was not an easy man to know. He was quiet in a way that had layers to it, sometimes the quiet of a man at peace, sometimes the quiet of a man working something through. He did not explain himself often, but he was consistent, in the way that matters most in a person. And he was kind in ways that were practical rather than performed. Yet he noticed things. He remembered things she mentioned once and never repeated. He did not crowd her, and he did not ignore her. And somewhere in the space between those two things, she found she could breathe. By November, she had stopped thinking of the house as his house. By December, she had stopped thinking of the marriage as her father's arrangement. It was a Tuesday in late January when she came downstairs and found him at the kitchen table with a letter in his hand and an expression she had not seen before. "My brother," he said, before she could ask. "He's coming out from Philadelphia in the spring. Wants to meet you." She poured herself coffee and sat across from him. "Are you worried about that?" He thought about it honestly, which was always how he thought about things. He's going to have opinions about how I've been living. "People tend to," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the closest thing to one she had seen in daylight, and it did something to her chest she chose not to examine too closely. "Celeste," he said. "Harlan. I'd like this to be a real marriage." He said it the way he said most things, directly, without decoration, looking at her steadily across the table. "I'm not asking you to decide today. I'm just saying I'd like that, if you ever get there." She looked at her coffee cup. Then she looked at him. "I think," she said carefully, "that I may already be there." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, the way he did when something mattered enough to be treated gently. Outside the kitchen window, the snow was coming down through the pines, white and unhurried, covering everything in Grover's Bluff, and everything on the mountain equally, the way weather has always refused to distinguish between what people think matters and what actually does. By spring, Celeste Whitfield had written her father 3 letters and received 4. The last one arrived in April, in Edmund Harrington's careful hand, and ended with a single line that she read twice before folding it and keeping it in her coat pocket for the rest of the day. "I was wrong about him," her father had written. "I am glad I was wrong." She showed it to Harlan that evening on the porch. He read it and handed it back without a word. But he took her hand afterward and held it in the particular way he had developed. Not tight, not loose, but just present, and they sat together, while the last of the daylight left the valley below. Gerald Sutter never did find another angle on the Whitfield property. He redirected his energies south the following year and did reasonably well for himself, which was probably more than he deserved. Ruth Pickett heard, through the reliable channels of Grover's Bluff, that the Whitfield place on the mountain was something extraordinary. She told everyone she had always sensed there was more to that man than met the eye. Nobody challenged her on it. 2 years after the wedding, on a Thursday morning in October, Harlan Whitfield came in from the porch, where he had been watching the first frost settle on the clearing, and found his wife at the kitchen